Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history and is steadily growing, as I'm delighted to report. And today we look at, well, a pretty tall claim, and a fascinating claim, and a claim that I have a lot of sympathy for, which is that one of the greatest turning points in history is right here under my feet and around here, because it is Vienna. We are talking about The City of Ideas by Richard Cockett, that I have here in German translation. I have, I'm afraid, so far only read in German translation. Richard, welcome to the show.
Hello, very, very nice to be here, Philip. Thanks for inviting me.
Before we really delve into your work in this excellent book and your fascinating claim that much of what we call the modern world of the 20th century originated in Vienna and can be basically nailed down to one or two cafes if you really want to be particular about it. You're a senior editor at The Economist. That's a magazine for clever clogs, as everyone knows. What drew your attention to Vienna particularly? You've been writing about Latin America. You've been writing about Asian dictatorships. You've been writing about a lot of things that have very little to do with modern Vienna. So how come that your interest was kindled in this?
Thanks, Philip. Well, the origin story of the book is what you want, and that's quite an interesting one in itself. So, to go back many decades in time, so I was an academic in an earlier life, and quite early on in my late 20s, so this is in the kind of late 1980s, early 1990s, I got a fellowship, 3-year fellowship, British Academy, to write a book about the origins of Thatcherism and per se Reaganism in the United States. So my subject was, where did the revival of economic liberalism, free market economics, some people call it neoliberalism, come from? And I was doing this while most of the main protagonists were still active in politics or just retired. And I grew up in the 1980s, so I grew up with all these new ideas. And I wanted to know, where did they all come from? Why did the Britain and America and Europe, to a degree, changed so utterly during that decade? And very quickly, I came across the Austrian school of economists, who were very, very influential on Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative Party in the United States.
So that would be Friedrich von Hayek, for instance.
This would be Friedrich von Hayek, mainly in Britain, Hayek and Ludwig von Mises in the United States, but also lesser-known characters like Fritz Matschlup, Gottfried Habler, and Peter Drucker, not a member of the Austrian school, but allied to them in the United States. Political philosophers like Karl Popper, very influential in Britain with his great book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And as I delved down into this, I got to know them well, and Hayek founded its great liberal think tank in 1947 called the Montpellier Society, and I think I was the first person to ever write about that, or to give an account of how it started and its influence. So I did all that, wrote several chapters. The book was well received when it came out in 1994, and then I moved on to lots of other things, as you suggest. So I left the Austrians, and I thought, well, that's an interesting little story. But when I wrote about lots of other things in the subsequent decades, about lots of different subjects, psychology, advertising, business, so this was for The Economist, sometimes not The Economist, the origins of marketing, a lot of literature, often, I found an Austrian, a Viennese, at the bottom of this. So usually a Viennese had written.
Bernays still a Viennese in your book?
Yes, Eddie Bernays is a Viennese in my book. Exactly. So lots of exactly people like that. So I began to philosophy, of course, with Wittgenstein, very well known, and I could see that many people had written individual stories about some of these great figures, and often also some of these figures were still entirely neglected. More often, nobody knew that in fact they were born and educated in Vienna. So I decided that, as a group study, this was really interesting. And in their creative uh, sort of milieu of 1870 to 1934, really, lay the roots of all these amazing innovations and advances across, a vast array of subjects which nobody seemed to be aware of. So that's the origins of the book.
Now, listen, that's fascinating, and I want to come back to just that argument in a moment. But you have sort of pinged so many bells in passing that I just have to pick up on this, because on this podcast, I've been slightly obsessed with the crisis of the liberal project, as I call it. And some of the podcasts some of the episodes are devoted to that. Um, and I was reminded of that very sharply when I listened last week to a friend of mine, Ivan Krastev, who here in Vienna spoke at a public event. And he said, we all look at 1989 as an iconic event. And that iconic event is the fall of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I'm Bulgarian, and for us, it was the retreat from Afghanistan. And for Chinese people, it was Tiananmen Square. And for Osama bin Laden, it was the resurgence of jihadist Islam in the wake of the retreating Soviets. And it has meant so many different things to so many different people, but only one narrative was allowed to prevail. Do you recognize something in that? I'm just beginning to work on a project now at the beginning of the 21st century, as a century of enormous liberal hubris and a study in the fact that winning makes you stupid.
Well, that's a big subject. Well, I've got a few thoughts about that. First of all, I know many people are obsessed with 1989. I completely get that. I was writing in England. I rushed to Berlin to see the fall of the Berlin Wall and was traveling along the Iron Curtain at that time, all wondering when this was going to happen, what was going to take place. But when I was writing that first book, for me, the really pivotal year is 1979, not 1989, because it was 1979 that Britain radically changed course. Mrs. Thatcher was elected. It was the end of what we in Britain call the post-war consensus, the sort of Keynesian, social democratic, liberal left consensus that had basically ruled since 1940. And at that time, British politics moved pretty well in lockstep with American politics. So, of course, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected, and America too moved sharply to the right at that moment. If you like, in America, Richard Nixon was the precursor of Ronald Reagan, much as in a way Edward Heath was a kind of rather limp precursor of Mrs. Thatcher in the United States. So these reactions against the dominance of liberal left, social democratic, socialist, progressive ideas, that consensus had been happening way before anything happened in 1989.
That has certain historical echoes to today when you talk about reactions against a liberal establishment and liberal ideas and policies.
Yeah, that's right. I'll give you one story which would be good for your podcast, which we did put in the Economist. So in 1989, as the wall came down, etc., there was, as you say, a great deal of economic liberal, free market, Thatcherite hubris about this, that we had defeated the Soviets for the end of the Cold War. And as you know, this then obscure American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, then encapsulated that feeling in his little, it was then just an article written for not Foreign Affairs, but one of those other American foreign policy quarterlies or monthly magazines called The End of History. I think that came out in 1990. I think it came out just after the end of the war, at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mrs. Thatcher was still in power then. She was still Prime Minister. And a lot of her advisors, the people I was talking about in my book, seized this document, The End of History, as the intellectual justification for their life's work. And that, the war was now over, the intellectual war was now over, they could rest on their laurels. Mrs. Thatcher had a very insightful private secretary, famous Foreign Affairs private secretary, called Charles Pole. And Charles, every night Mrs. Thatcher went home as Prime Minister, she went home with what we in Britain call a red box full of documents that she was supposed to peruse overnight, official papers, etc. And the top of this, Charles Pole slipped in The End of History, Francis Fukuyama's little document, little article, with a little scribbled note on it saying, "You should read this. It shows that you won." And he thought she'd really like it, and he'd get brownie points for putting it in the red box. And the next morning, Mrs. Thatcher handed in the red box. Everything, as usual, was ticked and signed and looked at. But she was very displeased with Fukuyama's thesis, Fukuyama's little article on the end of history. And she was scribbled all over with no, all over it. And Charles Pole asked her, why? Surely this vindicates your whole political career, your and Reagan's political career. Look, you won the Cold War. It's the triumph of democracy, liberalism. And she said, yes, but these the values never triumph. It is a constant struggle. This asks us to rest on our laurels. You can never rest on your laurels. Even at this very moment, people will be devising ways to push back against this new consensus. So I'm not resting, neither should you. Nothing of this is a given. Nothing of this is set in stone. The struggle goes on, and there will be highs and lows, but it will continue. And Charles Pole was, wow, that's pretty strong. But in fact, of course, she was absolutely correct. She, for one, was not going to be affected by the liberal hubris. But I think you're absolutely right. A lot of them were. And of course, that, if you like, vindication of Thatcherism, of economic liberalism, lasted right into the 1990s. And, the first really big setback, I would argue, came with the financial crash of 2008, 2009. That is a much more pivotal moment, because not only in Britain and America, but more importantly overseas, these doctrines then came into serious question. Because, for instance, take China. China had happily accepted that from the 1970s onwards, that this new brand of Austrian school capitalism, that's what it was, Austrian school capitalism, created wealth. It was the only engine to create wealth, the only way to create wealth, to lift people out of poverty, to extend trade, etc. And they had implemented it in China with extraordinary results. And they'd really swallowed all the West stuff about this is the best system, this is the way to go, this is the way to create wealth. And then bang, 2008, 2009, the whole system seems to collapse, contagion sets in, etc. And that's when people begin to really question whether that model is the best model. for not only the West but to be exported overseas. So that's how I see it. It's a sort of continuum, really, from 1979 up to 2008, 2009. So that's the context, and you fit 1989 somewhere into that continuum.
I'm grateful for you to open up the historical window a little further. And but just before I found this a very interesting moment, a very insightful moment. And so just before we're going back to Vienna around 1900, let me just pursue this for a little bit more. There is a very interesting interview online between Ian Bremmer and Rahm Emanuel from about a fortnight ago, where Rahm Emanuel said, "Look, I'm going to say something that you don't like about the Trump election." And he says, in 2001, we started a war under fraudulent pretenses, basically, and thousands of people's lives were destroyed in Iraq, hundreds of thousands, and nobody was held responsible. In 2008, speculation caused this crisis, and the bankers were soon negotiating higher boni, and nobody was held responsible. We screwed up. It was malgovernance. This was a liberal elite governing badly. And I thought that was a very salient point. That was a very important point, to remember these moments where there has really been an anti-democratic elite dynamic in our societies that has harmed the credibility of the democratic model.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, of course, when you drill down into the detail a lot, the Bush administration of 2001 would balk at the idea of being classed together as the liberal elite. They were supposed to be the anti-liberals, elected to take down the House of Clinton and all their kind of dreadful, hippie dope smoking liberal folk who'd infested politics in the 1990s. So it doesn't it doesn't quite fit. It's a better fit in Britain, of course, because the great advocate of the Iraq War and everything in the States was indeed Tony Blair, the quintessential leader of the international liberal elite. So it's a sort of better fit in Britain, and in Britain the template fits much better because, of course, most people in Britain were against the Iraq War. Most members, by far the overwhelming majority of members of the Labour Party, Blair's own party, was against the Gulf War. And of course, the reaction that set in eventually led to the election of Jeremy Corbyn and a dramatic shift to the left in British politics. So then you get into populism.
There are very clear echoes there, because I mean it's to come to your book directly because there's a direct connection. You start with a beautiful first chapter describing the Vienna everybody knows and loves, with all the art and thought and music and blah-de-blah-de-blah. It's beautifully written, and then comes directly a chapter about the other Vienna. The Vienna of the poor people who live outside, who are marginalized, who have tough living conditions, who are looking for a strong guy to disrupt the system as it is, because the system as it is doesn't work for them. And that happens to be a populist politician called Karl Lueger, who is still, of course, much battled about in this city, famously around a monument that is still standing to him, because in the recent years of historical reevaluation, the most salient fact about him was that he was a terrible anti-Semite, though an entirely opportunist one, who used that for political means and used it very effectively and very revoltingly, but personally had Jewish friends and thought that it was a sport for the plebs. but who happened to be also a very revolutionary and important mayor of Vienna, who completely transformed the city, who breached the boundaries between inside and outside, who gave it its modern infrastructure. And indeed, he may have been a pioneer for city planning much beyond Vienna.
Yeah, he invented what we in Britain really call municipal socialism. He was the most effective implementer of municipal socialism on the continent, and that's why he's revered to this day in Vienna, and why that statue still stands.
He was a bit of an inspiration for young Adolf Hitler.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
But I mean, I always like the figure of Karl Lueger, especially because it shows the ambiguity of history. And the fact that you can never neatly decide who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And first of all, historical 2020 hindsight is something very cheap. But secondly, also, here we've got a figure who has clearly had a big effect in two very different directions. And it's almost equally important in both. What do you do with that?
Well, the city of Vienna has grappled with this, as you know, and there's been a little bit of cancelling going on. So, as you know, the part of the Ringstrasse outside of the university used to be called the Karl-Lueger-Strasse, but it is no longer called that. So now you're left with the statue in the square, as you say, opposite the Museum of Applied Art, the MAC, which is usually daubed in paint these days and otherwise defaced. My friend, the historian, I'm sure you know him, Oliver Rutkolb, was commissioned to write a little, it's sort of a sign at the bottom, an explanatory sign discussing Lueger and telling people about the significance of him, as well as his anti-Semitism, trying to explain why the statue, why the people of Vienna thought it fit to erect a statue to this man, despite the fact that he was the first anti-Semitic politician in modern European history. So why he's both revered and reviled at the same time. As you probably know, there have been more discussions about what to do with the statue. So now they've decided to give it a little tilt. So they're going to lean the statue slightly. So he's now going to be sort of not only daubed in paint, but slightly off kilter as well.
I must say, that there's another little footnote to this, which is that all this. I mean, can we call it cultural posturing? Ends up costing hundreds of thousands. All these processes, and even tilting the bloody statue will, cost hundreds of thousands, building new foundations and making sure. So sometimes, I do think, wouldn't that be money well spent on schools? But
I agree entirely with you. I think it's a needless. I think it's a needless gesture. I think at that point you either get rid of it or just keep it. Maybe have a large explainer board, but
employ another teacher in an inner city school. I think that would be a really smart idea.
Well, I'm just saying that, but it does get to the point of the whole debate about Karl Lueger and what to do with the statue speaks very much to your point about the ambivalence and ambiguities of historical figures, and there's no better example of that than Karl Lueger, because for me, he clearly creates the roots of modern populism, and what we call modern populism are really in Karl Lueger and his politics and the new politics that he creates. I mean, across the board. So it's not only in terms of his policies. So what he does with his anti-Semitism is to unite disgruntlements and grievances amongst quite a sort of wide range of people who would not otherwise have anything in common. But he unites those grievances.
Let me push back on that, because, I mean, surely people will now ask, okay, we know of populists since the ancient Greeks. We've got populist moments in Shakespeare plays. Populism wasn't new. What is so new about Karl Lueger and how he defines populism that draws a straight line between him and Donald Trump or Viktor Orban?
For me, it's because he was doing it in a modern democratic state. That's the great thing. What does that do? Well, that means that he uses he doesn't use populists in the past, like the great kings of Shakespeare, etc., bread and circuses. They use a lot of violence, wars, etc. They don't have any. They don't have any care for a popular mandate in terms of a democratic mandate. Luega does have to pay attention to all these things. He's operating within a modern capitalist democratic system. They don't have there's not a full franchise when he's around before the First World War, but nonetheless, many people have the right to vote, and more people have the right to vote. Everyone gets the right to vote after the First World War. So that's why, for me, he's an important turning point, because he's the first leader, populist leader, who has to extract populism or populist politics from a modern democratic politics and therefore undermine it, which is indeed exactly what happens to Vienna, as you know, after 1934 and then unalterably after 1938. And that's why Hitler, I think, likes him, because that's why Hitler's so interested in him. Hitler, for your listeners, is in Vienna, of course, in the years before the First World War. He was born in Linz and then comes to Vienna to learn art, hopefully enroll in art schools, but in fact he wanders around as a penniless postcard painter in those years before the First World War, when Lueger is at his height. And he copies a lot of Lueger's, the way he's a master of the theatre of politics, he's the master of the rhetorics of politics, and he's a master of, as I say, stitching together different voting constituencies in politics, uniting them in this case through a grievance politics, identifying the other as the source of your grievances, in this case, the Jews. As you say, undoubtedly, politically, he was an anti-Semite. He blamed the Jews publicly, launched campaigns against them for the woes of unemployment, of underemployment, for people losing their jobs to large corporations. This was his bread and butter. Personally, he had many Jewish friends. There's no evidence, I think, that he was ever personally antagonistic towards any of his personal Jewish friends. But nonetheless, it's the politics, it's the overall political belief system and the theatre of politics that he invented that was so important.
But we come to something else here, another ambiguity that to me is very powerful. You talk about the anti-Semitism and the resentment, but you also celebrate Vienna as an experiment of modernity and civilization, and we will come to it, how Vienna resulted in everything from the shopping mall to the splitting the atom. But one of those, everybody who looks at Vienna, and I've also written about it, but many people have been making the point, this was the crucible. This was, in fact, if we want to think about it, much more like either a Muslim city or a New World city than like a European city. In 1900, half of all Viennese people, all people living in Vienna, don't have German as their mother language. The degree of migration, of diversity is extraordinary. And hence also, as people always point out, diverging viewpoints, traditions, etc., and fecundity and, cross-fertilization, fantastic art, and how lovely. It is also a failed demographic experiment. Because, you say the Jews were blamed for much of this by anti-Semites such as Lueger. But what was actually blamed when the Jews were blamed was modernity or modernization. Because, if you were a little cobbler and there was a shoe factory around the corner, you were out of a job and your family went hungry. And there were many shoe factories around the corner. And this was the time when, a sort of lower middle craftsman class came under incredible pressure. And what do you know? Many of the people who worked in elevated positions in the factories were Jewish because they were more literate, to a much higher degree literate and educated than other people were. And in Vienna, you can see that very strongly. The success, but also the almost fatal success of a small demographic group who, because they had values in their culture that through historical serendipity, some suddenly became valuable. They had always been useless, namely education. Just under 10% of the Viennese population is Jewish in 1918 or so, 200,000 people. By the way, an increase from 40,000 within a generation. So huge increase. But in the secondary schools, it's just about 20 to 30% of Jewish children. And at universities, studying law, studying medicine, studying other academics, almost 50%. In the newspapers, the editors are, almost 50%, which is because, if you compare it to the Bohemians, who are the other great immigrant group, among the Bohemians, 70% of people who come into the city work with their hands. Among the Jews, it's 7% because they are in trade or other things. So, of course, they are not going to rise to the professional positions because they treat their children. Education means something. So we can understand how this elite formation works, but we can also see that all the aggression that builds up for very understandable reasons against a galloping modernization of society is basically heaped upon the heads of the Jews, who become a very useful symbol for all this change and all this dissociation from a traditional world. And well, we know where that led. Are there any lessons in that?
I mean, you are absolutely right, and it's a huge. You are absolutely right, and it's it's a huge subject and a very pertinent one now as it was then. There's no question that Jews were synonymous with modernity, and in some ways, Jews were very conscious of this and were happy to be synonymous with modernity.
Modernity was for them liberation from the shtetl as well.
Exactly. Well, it's liberation from from Catholicism, from the Catholic elite of Austria, from the aristocracy, from the shtetl, from their own roots, if you like, the leap, the graduation from Leopoldstadt across the Danube Canal to the first district. All that. And of course, ironically, right at the top of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ironically, the state encouraged this because one of the things that they used to hold the creaking Austro-Hungarian Empire together was modernism in art, the secession movement, because they recognized that this embodied, if you like, supranational values, the values of modernism, the arguments of modernism transcended ethnicity, transcended narrow nationalisms. And so even the emperor and the court and the official organs of the empire promoted modernism and therefore promoted Jewish interest because they thought this was a unifying factor in their creaking house of the Habsburg Empire. So this was encouraged from the top as well. So it's interesting. I mean, I've studied this in other instances. For instance, in the British Empire, where the Gujaratis from India, from northwest India, they formed a very successful little ethnic group who did very, very well in the British Empire and were scattered through as the great entrepreneurs and business builders throughout the British Empire, particularly in, say, the East African colonies of Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda particularly, where they flourished, built huge businesses, very successful businesses there, became a very literate class, were resented vastly for this by the indigenous Black African populations. And one of the consequences of independence of those countries from the British Empire in the early 1960s, late 1950s, was that a decade on, the rulers of those countries often tried to expel those Asians from, mostly Gujaratis, from their countries, often back to Britain, because by then a lot of them held British passports. So they were resented as a symbol of modernity, because they brought modernity to those countries, and they were encouraged by the British to do so, and they again suffered for that hugely. And I've often looked at the two. Rishi Sunak, incidentally, our last Prime Minister, was descended from such a family. I think his family were Tanzanian immigrants. They were immigrants from India to Tanzania and then to Britain, holding British passports. But so I've often thought about the comparisons between the two, and the question is, could either have done anything better, anything more, to assuage, to appease, perhaps, the forces that were gathering against them? That's the question. And would this have made any difference? That's basically the question you're asking me.
Well, I also think, there seems to me, frankly, a sort of leitmotif that goes on through today, which is that we have societies that are being plowed up by digitization, by rapidly developing technologies, by globalized economic structures. And the one symptom of that people see on the street are people of different color and speaking different languages. They don't see the banking arrangements behind it. They don't see the changes in tax legislation. They don't see in the decimated rainforests. What they see is these people look different, and now they're here. And before they were there, things were simpler. I think that this finding a symbolic culprit is something that we have very acutely today in Europe for much of the same reasons, namely that effectively they're harbingers of modernity, of a huge rush of modernization, of change that societies find very hard to absorb.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in Europe, there's a particular twist to that, which was, of course, the rule of Soviet communism for the decades after the Second World War. So in Europe, you got, which in Eastern Europe certainly, you got this sort of demand of a pent-up nationalism. And I think that becomes a very important factor. You're in Vienna at the moment, aren't you? Not a million miles away from Hungary. Hungary is a very good example of this quite toxic mix of a pent-up nationalism, which explodes, of course, after 1989, and is, and the Hungarians and the Czechs, etc., are lauded in the West for the struggle against Soviet communism and for finding their nationhood and for founding independent nations. But of course, the same liberals who applaud that are then appalled by the fact that this nationalism, which is celebrated in the 1990s, actually turns into quite a narrow nationalism in the Hungarian example, and an exclusive nationalism. And it's a nationalism which is defined by the Hungarians, not by us. And then, so that's when you start, very naughty, very naughty. And that's when you start this great cleavage between the Hungarian nationalism as defined by Orbanism and nationalism as is defined by the European Union, which are two very different things.
Another element to that point, which I find very interesting, is also that someone has drawn my attention to it, that in 1968, which was so foundational for the US and for Western Europe, the 1968 sort of student revolt, the change in sexual mores, in ideas of personal liberty, of individualism, etc., simply didn't take place behind the Iron Curtain. There was the brief moment of the Prague Spring, but otherwise it did not. I mean, that was crushed, and that was a disaster. And otherwise it simply had not taken place. That change of generational attitudes, or perhaps of elite generational attitudes, because that revolution really touched universities mostly. That had simply not taken place behind the Iron Curtain. I thought that was a very interesting observation.
Yeah, that is quite interesting, but I wonder how true that is. I mean, just to go back to Hungary for a second, one of the the great it depends what you thought about 1968, of course, vitally, because certainly Britain, America, and other parts of Western Europe, you'll find that the great reaction against post-war social democracy, liberalism, left-wing hippiedom, freedom, if you like, as defined by the 1960s, begins in 1968, and it's borne by those who are close observers of the barricades in Paris, the demonstrations in Grosvenor Square in London. And going back to Hungary, to give you a concrete and, as it turned out, very consequential example of this. So, as you may know, the great hero of Orbanism, of Orban and the new Hungarian nationalism, is a relatively obscure English philosopher, and I use the word English advisedly rather than British, a philosopher called Roger Scruton. And you may even had coffee in a Roger Scruton cafe in Budapest.
I did not, and I never met him.
Well, next time you go to Budapest, they've opened this sort of chain of Roger Scruton. He's a cult, so they're trying to make him the new Marx. It's a cult figure, and he's the great English conservative philosopher of the last 20, 30 years. He never made much headway in England, precisely because he was on the other side of the barricades in 1968. The moment when Scruton became a nationalist and a conservative with a small c and a big C was when he went to Paris in 1968 to join the students. And he went there like Burke with the French Revolution, thinking that, this is very exciting, the birth of a new world. In fact, he was so appalled by what he saw in Paris and the junking of everything the junking of all value, of all traditional values, the junking of tradition, the trashing of all norms of behavior, sexual, emotional, political behavior, etc. That made him into a conservative, that moment in 1968. So there's a sort of wrinkle in your thesis there. About 68, that's all right, but a lot of what we now see being played out, particularly in places like Hungary, is precisely that reaction against 1968.
But 1968 also being something that is imposed by the West, like economic measures, like other things. It's a Western cultural thing, these ideas.
They are sort of Western cultural things. But I wasn't there, but we're told that the great pent-up demand for Beatles records and Rolling Stone records was huge in the Eastern Bloc as it was in the West. So I'm not sure it didn't penetrate there. But so you've got this kind of mixed history in places like Hungary of this great nationalism reaction against Soviet communism, which we didn't have in the West, of course, because we didn't have to throw off the yoke of this supranational Soviet communism. Our reaction was later when we thought we had to throw off the yoke of the supranationalist EU. That was our little revolution here in Britain, called Brexit, of course applauded by Viktor Orban and the Orbanistas as an equivalent revolution to their nationalist revolution against Soviet communism.
By the way, I always find it interesting to point out that the recent elections in Britain and in Austria and also in France, they brought right-wing majorities in Austria, and in Britain exactly the same thing happened, namely half of the conservative voters sheared off and went to the far right. But because of the different voting system, it brought a landslide victory for Labour, who only got 1% more than they had done in the previous election. But listen, it's so fascinating to talk to you, but we do want to get back to your book. And there's one thing that I want to explore in particular with Vienna sort of with ideas from Vienna sort of shining out into the world as you describe, also of course because of the Second World War and because of all the exiles, especially to the United States, but also to other countries where all these people who had been basically bred in this creative hothouse that was Vienna at this time were released into the world, as it were. And you detail them in their biographies, but I'm always very interested in the law of unforeseen consequences. Because, here you have Hayek, who is basically conceiving of his economic idea of theory as a safeguard against dictatorship, against totalitarianism. No state overreach, because he sees state overreach in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union, and he thinks, how can we preserve personal liberty? Which is not how, we think today of a neoliberal economic ideal, because as a safeguard against fascism, basically. And there's the other beautiful story of the shopping mall that is conceived to be a modern village, where people are finally find the social cohesion again that they have lost in the modern suburb. Tell me what that has to do with Vienna and how these unforeseen consequences play out.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. The book is in large degree a story of unforeseen consequences. But take the shopping mall first, which is it is a wonderful story. So this concerns Victor Gruen, who was born in Vienna. He was a son of Red Vienna, when Vienna was ruled by this great social democratic city council from the end of the First World War, 1919 to 1934. Like many of Red Vienna, he has to emigrate, forced into exile in the 1930s. And he takes his skills as an architect, trains as an architect, takes his skills as an architect to America. But unusually, he's applying those skills from a very early time to shopping, to shop fronts. And he is much in demand in New York in the late 1930s and 40s with upmarket shopping retail outlets on Fifth Avenue, jewelers, shoe shops, etc., to design their shop frontages. Because of that time, of course, before the internet age, it was all about bricks and mortar shopping. So the shop front was hugely important. The way that was the means of bringing shoppers in to your store to part with their money. And the Viennese basically transferred their skills as architects, modernists, to clear the clutter that then existed in shop fronts and make them into sort of modern, beautiful...
Which is very Adolf Loos and Wiener Werkstätte.
Exactly, made them into beautiful, if you like, stage sets, theatre sets, film sets, beautified them to draw people in, to give them a sense of wonder as they came into these stores and then part with their money. Victor Gruen was fantastically successful at doing this, and after several journeys, he ended up on the West Coast. But he was also he remained always a social democratic Viennese to his heart and an admirer of Vienna. and I can see you smiling, but I will kind of work this out for you. That he was so he moved to the West Coast, and he was both an admirer of America. He was an admirer of its consumer culture. He was an admirer of its vigor. He was an admirer of its democracy. And he saw it, of course, as the great opponent of totalitarian Soviet communism. This was the era of the Cold War. He was also, though, a critic of American modernism, a particular aspect of American modernism, which was basically the flight to the suburbs, what we now call the atomization of American society, the retreat of the family into their suburban homes, the rule of the car, the gas-guzzling car, the endless sort of motorways. People never met anymore. They all clustered around. It sounds also familiar, clustered around their TVs at home. Nobody knew, there were no points of communion, of interchange anymore. So he designed a space to solve these problems and to overcome these problems that would bring people together. And his model for this was very much Vienna, his hometown, which he always loved. And he saw in Vienna, the first city of Vienna, the very model of modern living, where everybody was very close to each other. All the amenities one could want were cheek by jowl. There was quite a big mixture of rich, poor, of the different classes. They all shopped, etc., from the same markets. You had the great democracy of the coffee houses, where everybody could meet and exchange ideas for the price of a melange, a coffee melange, and everyone did, etc. It's an idealized vision of Vienna, but you get what I'm talking about. And he conceived the mall as in the mid-1950s, as an answer to America's problems and to give them a Vienna under one roof with air conditioning in the middle of the desert, to draw Americans together again, to solve the atomization of American society, and to bring people together again of different races, ethnicities under one roof, where they could shop, they could have food, they could go to cafes, they could go to cinemas, they could enjoy, they used to have little zoos and green parks within these cafes, so they can enjoy some sort of some nature. They had waterfalls, etc. And so they would park the car, they drop the car vitally outside the mall, then they would spend the day without the car, finally get them out of the car, walking around like you do in Vienna in the first district, strolling around from cafe to shop to a post office, taking in some entertainment, etc. And that was his conception of the mall. The first one of which he did in the United States in 1954. And then it caught on like wildfire, of course, and then within a few years, thousands of these things were being built all around the United States and then abroad. And I argue in my book, which I think is pretty incontestable, that given the popularity of the mall around the world, particularly now in Asia, no single person has done more to influence and alter the urban geography of the modern world than this completely unknown Viennese architect, Victor Gruen. And the fate of the shopping mall, the shopping mall fell radically out of favour in the 1980s. This was the decades of the mall rat and crime in the malls, etc. But I think nowadays it's undergone a kind of huge revival, and a very successful revival. I live in West London, about a quarter of an hour's drive, 10 minutes drive from the biggest mall in this part of the world, called Westfield, where I do all my shopping now. I thought originally I would keep well away from it, but it's it's a fantastic facility, and as I wander around it, I always think of Victor Gruen and how he would have liked this particular incarnation of his idea, because it really does it's a very safe environment for Muslim shoppers. So there's a sort of very high proportion of Muslim women shoppers and men. It's got a lot of London's ethnic minority shop there. A lot of young people, a lot of older people. It's constantly busy, constantly mixing. It's absolutely serving the purpose that Victor Gruen conceived of, 70 years ago. And all these people milling around Westfield, they'll have no idea who Victor Gruen is or was, but they'll owe him a lot. So, from your point of view, Victor Gruen's a kind of really interesting figure because he's both a modernist and a critique of some of the downsides of modernism. And of course, the mall then develops into something of a scourge in America. It goes through a very bad phase in the 80s and 90s, and then is criticized for a lot of the ills of urban America because it empties out inner cities because everyone is now moving to suburbs because they have the mall. An inner city is empty of shops because you can shop in the malls. So it has a sort of reverse effect. And I think over the long term, these sort of innovations do take time to settle down and to find their place over what Obama always called the long arc of history. They will find their place and they will find a way of satisfying the inventors, if you like, creative vision. And I think the mall is now in a place where that's happening. But that is Victor Gruen, the Viennese. And I also like to think, of course, as I wander around Westfield, that I'm in, a little Vienna here in West London.
Tell me, Richard, one other thing that is really revolutionary in Vienna, and I happen to know that still draws researchers from all over the world here, especially architects and city planners. You mentioned it, but not all of our listeners may be aware of it, is Red Vienna. Now, Vienna has been in solid socialist hands with a little Nazi interlude and a little Austro-fascist interlude in between, but for the last 100 years. And one of the most remarkable things about Vienna, which is still a city that regularly wins awards for its quality of life, and you see that everything that's public is running really well. But one of the most remarkable things about Vienna that really was visionary was this public building project that was started directly after the First World War. So when the country was in the deepest crisis and had no money at all for anything, they started building these enormous blocks, some of them for thousands of people, hundreds of families, that were light, that had tree-lined courtyards, that had doctors' practices, libraries in them, and most importantly, small flats that had everything that you needed for a decent living. But one of the most remarkable things I think you still feel today when you live in the city, they did not build them out in satellite cities. They put them in every district in Vienna. Even in the richest districts, you have such social housing projects, and there is no effective ghettoization through these things that has taken place in the city. There are also, therefore, no-go areas in this city. Can you comment on that? How this extraordinary policy came about?
Now, this is for social housing you're talking about, and as you say, I think it goes a long way. It's one of the most, it is undoubtedly the most important legacy of Red Vienna. Red Vienna is very unknown in European and world history. Very few people are aware of it. I think it's because it was so utterly crushed by the Nazis when they came in 1938. And the thesis of my book is that if you want to look at Vienna's impact on the world and Vienna as a crucible of modernity of the modern world, you have to take the two periods together, the much more better known Golden Age, the fin de siècle Golden Age, as the age of Mahler and Freud and Wittgenstein, etc. You have to take that together with Red Vienna, 1919 to 1934. And Vienna as the crucible of modernity, the creative city, only works if you consider them together, because Red Vienna did so much to take the ideas of the fin de siècle era and apply them to everyday living and to, if you like, human progress, or the progress of creating what they called ambitiously a new human. This is a new human for a post-imperial, post-republic, post-First World War, when, as you say, Austria was prostrate, it was impoverished, it had lost the whole empire, famine stalked the city. It was in a terrible way, and yet they then began building these sort of monster housing blocks to accommodate the working class in as good a fashion as they could.
But you say monster housing blocks just for people who can't visualize that. Don't think 30-floor high-rise concrete blocks, but huge complexes of buildings of 4 to 5 floors with little flats, but also with a huge aesthetic agenda, ornamented, built as huge public sculptures, essentially. So yes, they're a monster, but you saw a vision of dignity also in them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean monster in size rather than aesthetic value. And if you doubt the term monster in terms of size, visitors to Vienna should absolutely go and see the Karl Marx Hof, which remains, as I think, the single most impressive tribute to Red Vienna, which is a vast one of these social housing blocks in the on the outskirts of the city, actually, by one of the train stations, which I think was, at the time, it was Europe's largest single inhabited building, and by some measures remains that. It's sort of the size of several city blocks. I think it has 3 separate kind of tram stops running alongside it. It's so big, several huge courtyards in between, etc., etc. It's sort of conceived on a sort of monumental scale. Yes, and the idea of Red Vienna, this was a very kind of good example of what Red Vienna was about, which is about applying all the latest advances in aesthetics, in building materials, in mechanics, in design, etc., to building these social housing blocks, to building a new society.
But also very importantly, I think, economics here, and in sort of ergonomics. I mean, they looked at how a body works.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and they had all these kind of absolutely important breakthroughs, which were very important for the rest of the world. The most famous, of course, being the fitted kitchen. So the fitted kitchen was invented by a Viennese woman called Margaret Schütte-Lihotzky, precisely for these housing blocks, of this social housing. And her task was to try and invent a new space, a new domestic interior, which would be efficient. It would save space. It would be compact, because of course you were building hundreds of flats in these housing blocks, and useful and efficient for the working mother, for the new working mother. And that's how she came up with the fitted kitchen, as you say. And she was applying the latest science of she applied time and motion studies as developed in America by William Taylor. Normally we are familiar with these studies as applied to industrial production lines at the Ford plants in Detroit, Fordism. She applied time and motion studies to the domestic interior. So she worked out very carefully how much time the woman would spend washing, how she moved around the old flat, wasting time moving things from one side of the flat to the other, and brought it all together in one room to save time, make her life more efficient. Yeah.
It just occurs to me, it's also such an important valorization of female work, of the female role. This was a very important city for feminism as well, with people like Rosa Mayreder, some of the most avant-garde feminists. And here we've got someone actively thinking about women as constructive members of society who have their work, whose work has to have the same efficiency and dignity.
Yeah, but more than that, but the twist was that she was making the woman's life more efficient. She was trying to save the woman time in her domestic duties, in order to free her up to do other things, to be a good mother, to bring up the children properly, to have a job, to have a life. So that was the grand project, and ultimately for the city council socialists to spend more time on being a good socialist woman, which they took extremely seriously. So it was both the sort of feminists, modern feminists, are sort of the verdict's out for them on what these city councils were trying to do. Because, to many, freeing up women to have more time to bring up families is not exactly a liberating female agenda. So, but nonetheless, I think, at the time, it was incredibly pioneering, the Fitted Kitchen, about what they were trying to do. And just the whole fact of devoting a lot of time and energy to the woman around the house, that was extremely new and novel, and making sure that the woman would have a better time, a more efficient time, and a less back-breaking time doing these domestic tasks than she previously had. That was very new and modern. So within building these social housing blocks, the inventiveness spread over to many other aspects of life. These spread well beyond Vienna. The Fitted Kitchen is sometimes known as the Frankfurt Kitchen because she was then nicked by the Frankfurt City Council in the late 1920s. They saw what Vienna was doing and wanted to do the same sort of social housing in Frankfurt. So the first thing they did was take Margaret Schütte-Lihotzky to design all the kitchens for their social housing in Frankfurt. And the other thing is the advantage of it could be reproduced at scale because it was all fitted together, and that became known as the Frankfurt Kitchen. It was fitted into all the Frankfurt social housing blocks as well.
Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It still is, but I know that you have to go away. I could spend many more hours explaining what Vienna has meant to the modern world, but if you're interested, read Richard's book, City of Ideas, it's called in English, and it's been published last year in English, this year in German. Richard Cockett, thank you so much for being my guest on the Blomcast, and thank you for listening or watching us, and you can subscribe to this podcast. That would really help me out. You can do it right now. Look, there's the little button. Just press it now. Thank you. That's much better. Tell all your friends and relations about the Blomcast and that you can hear conversations as brilliant as this one with Richard Cockett. So thank you all very much and see you next time.